Deep in the heart of a remote wildlife sanctuary, where the trees stretched far above the ground and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the forest had its own rhythm. Days blended into nights and the natural world continued its cycles, untouched by human hands. But beneath a canopy, secrets often whispered in the wind, and sometimes those secrets had a way of finding their way into the lives of those who dared to listen. Jenna, the sanctuary's lead conservationist, had lived here for years, working tirelessly to protect the wildlife and ensure that the fragile ecosystem remained undisturbed. She knew the forest intimately, the patterns of the animals, the seasonal shifts, the subtle hum of life all around her. But lately, something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that something in the woods was changing, something just beyond her reach, like a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. It started with the owl. Jenna had always admired the barn owls that inhabited the edges of the sanctuary. Their white, ghostly forms would swoop silently through the forest at dusk, their wide, dark eyes reflecting the last light of the day. But one particular owl had been different. It was a large, imposing figure, its wingspan vast and its presence heavy. Jenna had seen it on several occasions over the past week, perched on a branch high above the forest floor, staring down at her with an intensity that unnerved her. She often sensed that it was watching her, its head tilting at odd angles as if trying to understand something beyond its grasp. She shrugged it off at first. Animals, especially owls, were known to behave unpredictably, especially in the quiet solitude of the wilderness. But each encounter left her with a lingering discomfort, as though she was being judged, or perhaps warned. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Jenna set out for her usual patrol through the woods. The sanctuary was vast, and she had a routine of checking the traps, examining animal tracks, and ensuring that no trespassers had ventured too close. She carried only a lantern to light her way, the flame casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed unusually still, as though holding its breath. Jenna felt the familiar tension in her chest as she walked deeper into the woods, where the trees were closer together, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy. The stillness was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a night bird. Then she heard it. A soft, high-pitched hoot echoed from the trees ahead. The sound was unmistakable. It was the owl. But this time it was different. The hoot was sharper, more insistent. Jenna paused, feeling a sudden unease tighten in her stomach. She had never heard an owl make such a sound before. The hoots came again, and this time they seemed closer. Much closer. Her heart began to race, and instinctively she turned in the direction of the sound. The lantern flickered in her hand as the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves around her. The hoots continued, growing louder, more urgent. It was as if the owl was calling her, beckoning her to follow. Jenna hesitated for a moment, but the pull of the sound was too strong to ignore. She stepped forward, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor, each step carrying her deeper into the heart of the woods. The owl's calls guided her, the rhythm of the hoots creating an eerie soundtrack to her movements. Soon she found herself in a small clearing. The trees here were older, their bark gnarled and twisted, their branches stretching high into the sky like skeletal fingers. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, smooth, worn by time, and partially covered in moss. As Jenna approached, the hoots stopped abruptly. She looked up to see the owl perched on a branch above the stone, its eyes fixed on her with unnerving intensity. For a moment Jenna stood still, the weight of the owl's gaze heavy upon her. There was something in its eyes, a depth, a knowing, that unsettled her. It wasn't just the presence of the bird, but the feeling that she had stumbled onto something that had been hidden, something that was not meant to be uncovered. The air felt colder now, and Jenna's breath formed visible puffs in the dim light of the lantern. She moved closer to the stone, drawn by a strange, unexplainable pull. The owl's stare never wavered. As she reached the stone, she noticed something strange. A faint marking etched into the surface, half hidden by the moss. It was a symbol, something familiar but not quite right. Jenna crouched down, brushing away the moss, revealing the full shape. A chill ran down her spine. The symbol was old, far older than anything she had seen in her years at the sanctuary. It resembled an ancient rune, twisted and malformed, its lines jagged as though it had been carved in haste. Jenna's fingers hovered over the markings, feeling the coldness of the stone beneath her touch. As soon as her skin made contact, the owl hooted again, its call sharp and insistent. The ground beneath her feet trembled. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight vibration, like a distant rumble. But then it grew, a deep, resonating tremor that seemed to reverberate through the very air around her. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying as if caught in an invisible wind. Jenna's heart raced, and she pulled her hand away from the stone, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. The owl let out one final, ear-piercing screech, and in that moment, the ground beneath her cracked open, the tremors intensified, and Jenna stumbled backward, her lantern falling to the ground, its light sputtering out in the dark. The owl's wings beat the air as it took flight, soaring above her in the growing darkness. Jenna's breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around, her mind racing to comprehend what was happening. The earth beneath her was splitting, revealing a dark, cavernous hole that seemed to stretch down into the very bowels of the earth. The trees around her groaned in protest, their roots twisting as the ground shifted and cracked. She turned to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The owl's hoots echoed through the air, fading as she sprinted back toward the sanctuary, the tremors subsiding behind her. When she reached the safety of the lodge, she collapsed, gasping for air, her heart still pounding in her chest. It was hours before she could calm herself, but when she did, her mind returned to the owl and the strange symbol. She knew that something ancient and powerful had been awakened in the forest that night, something that had been hidden beneath the earth for centuries. The owl had been its guardian, its messenger, and she, Jenna, had unknowingly uncovered a truth that had been waiting to be discovered. But what would happen now? And why had the owl chosen her? The answers, she realized, were buried deep within the forest, and perhaps within herself. And the owl, perched somewhere in the shadows, would continue to watch, waiting for her next move. The forest had its secrets, and it was far from done with Jenna. Jenna spent the next few days in a restless haze. Her body ached from the adrenaline and the terror of that night, but it was her mind that refused to rest. The owl had warned her, of that she was sure, but what had it been trying to protect her from? What had she unleashed? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even when she was alone in the sanctuary. The dense forest, once a source of comfort and familiarity, now felt alien and hostile. She walked the trails in the daylight, hoping to find some clue, some sign that would explain what had transpired in the clearing. But the more she looked, the more it seemed like the forest was closing in around her, swallowing her every step. One evening, several days after the tremors had stopped, Jenna stood at the edge of the forest, gazing into the thickening gloom of the woods. Her lantern, though she had it with her, was no longer a comfort. It felt inadequate, its feeble light swallowed by the vastness of the darkness. And then, from deep within the trees, came that familiar sound, a single piercing hoot. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a shiver of recognition deep in her bones. The owl was near. It had to be. Without thinking, Jenna stepped into the forest once more. She had to know what was happening. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something important, something critical, was slipping through her fingers. The owl had led her here, and now it was calling her again. She followed the sound, deeper into the forest than she had ever gone before. The path became indistinct as the trees grew more densely packed. She had been here 100 times before, but tonight, it felt like an entirely different world. There were no signs of animals, no rustling of leaves underfoot except her own. Even the wind had stopped, and the silence was suffocating. The hoot came again, closer now, but still distant enough that it led her deeper into the night. Minutes or hours passed. Time seemed irrelevant here, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Jenna's lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows against the trees. Her eyes began to adjust to the dark, and then she saw it. The same clearing, the same stone. But something was different now. The earth around the stone had been disturbed. Scattered dirt and rocks lay in a heap, as if something had recently clawed its way out. A thin, dark line marred the once smooth surface of the stone, almost like a crack, but it ran deeper. The markings were no longer just a faint symbol. They were pulsing with a faint, unnatural glow, a pulse, steady and slow, like a heartbeat. Jenna's chest tightened as she approached the stone. She didn't want to touch it again, but something compelled her. She felt the presence of the owl, even if it wasn't visible. A breeze stirred the air, and as if on cue, a shadow shifted above her. She looked up, and there it was, its large dark eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon. The owl was perched in the same tree, watching her. This time there was no hoot. The owl simply stared. The wind began to pick up, its howling a stark contrast to the earlier stillness. The trees creaked and groaned under the pressure of the gusts. Jenna's heartbeat quickened. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. She could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a pressure, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the earth began to tremble again. Not as violently as before, but enough to send a shock through Jenna's body. The stone cracked open, splitting apart with a low rumble that reverberated through her bones. A heavy, damp scent rose from the fissure, and the darkness that spilled out seemed to devour the light around it. Something ancient, something buried deep beneath the earth, was awakening once again. The owl flew silently into the air, its wings barely making a sound as it circled above her head. The shadows around the stone seemed to grow darker, stretching toward her as if reaching out. Jenna couldn't move. Fear had paralyzed her body. She knew that the owl was not simply a messenger. It was the guardian of this dark secret, bound to it, tethered to the very earth itself. The wind howled louder, and the air grew thick with something tangible, something that didn't belong. The ground beneath Jenna's feet shuddered again, and a low, guttural growl emanated from the dark chasm. It wasn't an animal's growl, but something deeper, something older. A tremor ran through her, and she felt the weight of the forest press in on her from all sides. The owl's flight path began to grow erratic, its wings beating faster as if it were desperate to escape the growing chaos. Jenna's eyes snapped to the stone, and then to the shadowy abyss it had revealed. A figure emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate. It was large, hulking, and impossibly tall. At first, Jenna couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely, but as it stepped into the dim light, its form became clearer. The shape was twisted and contorted, as if it had been buried beneath the earth for millennia, its limbs outstretched in unnatural angles, its eyes glowing with an eerie, pale light. Jenna's blood ran cold. The figure advanced toward her, and though her mind screamed at her to run, her feet refused to move. The owl's frantic screech echoed in the trees, but it was too late. The figure's gaze locked with hers, and in that instant, Jenna felt as if the very soul of the forest had reached out and touched her. There was no turning back. The secret had been awakened and she had no choice but to bear witness. The owl, now circling above the figure, let out one final mournful cry, a warning that resonated through every fiber of Jenna's being. Then, with a soft rustle of feathers, it flew into the night, leaving her alone with the thing that had been buried in the earth for so long. And in that moment, she understood. The owl had never been watching her. It had been trying to keep her away from the forest, from the stone, and from what was waiting beneath it. Jenna's world blurred as the shadows closed in, and she knew with every breath that the forest's secrets were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Jenna's body felt as though it was frozen in place, her legs unresponsive, her breath shallow and strained. The creature before her, the figure that had emerged from the depths, stood silently, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. The air was thick, heavy, with an energy she couldn't comprehend, as if the very forest itself had shifted to accommodate the dark force now standing in front of her. The creature's presence seemed to absorb all the light, the trees around her swaying under the weight of something ancient and unfathomable. The wind howled through the branches, but in that clearing, it felt muffled, as if the world had been reduced to nothing but her and the thing standing before her. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, reaching out from the darkness in jagged angles, and it made no sound as it took one step closer. Jenna wanted to scream, to run, but every instinct in her told her that moving would be futile. The creature wasn't just part of the forest, it was the forest. It was the land itself, twisted into a form that defied the laws of nature. She could hear the owl's desperate calls now, growing distant, lost in the vastness of the night. It had abandoned her just as it had done long ago. Its duty was done, its warning clear. There was nothing left for her but to face the truth. The figure's gaze softened, its eyes shifting from the cold, otherworldly glow to something more human, more familiar. For a brief moment, Jenna felt as though the creature was looking into her soul, reading her every fear, every regret. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The connection was too deep, too overwhelming. The growl that had vibrated through the air earlier returned, this time louder and more distinct. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from within the earth itself, from the very ground beneath her feet. The sound seemed to rise in layers as though the earth was speaking, calling forth something that had been dormant for eons. Jenna's knees buckled as the tremors beneath her intensified. She could feel the very ground shifting, pulling at the roots of the trees, at the stone that had once held everything in place. It was as if the forest was tearing itself apart from the inside. The trees groaned in protest, their ancient bark splintering as the land heaved in a violent crescendo. In that moment, the truth hit her like a wave. The stone, the symbol, the ritual, the warnings, it had all been a part of this, a part of a cycle that had been set in motion long before she arrived. The forest was not a place of protection, it was a place of imprisonment, and the creature was the key, the guardian, the warden of a forgotten secret. The owl had known this. It had tried to protect her from it, but there was no escaping the inevitable. Jenna was a part of this now. She had come to the clearing not by chance, but because she was meant to. The stone had been waiting for someone to unlock its power, to break the seal, and she had been the one to do it. And the creature stepped closer, its movement fluid, its eyes now shifting in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of its being was unraveling. It reached out with one of its long, gnarled arms and gently touched her arm, sending a jolt of cold through her veins. The contact was electric, sending waves of understanding and fear crashing through her mind. Jenna could feel the pull of the earth, the weight of the forest's history pressing down on her. She had unlocked something that had been sealed away for centuries, and now it was awake. A sudden crack broke through the tension, loud and sharp, like the snap of a branch in the dead of night. The trees around her shook, their bark peeling away in thin strips, exposing the twisted, gnarled trunks beneath. The sky above seemed to darken even further, the stars fading as though consumed by the shadow of something vast and consuming. The creature began to move, its steps slow but purposeful, as if leading her somewhere. Jenna followed, her legs moving of their own accord now, her feet dragging through the dirt as though the forest itself was pulling her forward. She didn't understand why she was walking, why she couldn't stop, but she couldn't fight it anymore.